In this video, I have for you an incredible round 8 encounter from the European Team Championship between Magnus Carlsen and 2700 rated Super GM Van Foreest. Now, I want to get right into this game, so I'm not going to say anything else other than this is Magnus Carlsen at his finest, and it's a game you don't want to miss. Carlsen with the white pieces begins with e4, and after e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, we have knight to f6, the Berlin defense. Carlsen castles, allowing the pawn to be captured on e4, rook to e1, all theory, knight to d6, until we get to this moment here, and Carlsen, as we've come to expect, decides to play a move which is highly unusual, yet very playable. By far the most common move for white here is to capture the pawn on e5, but Carlsen plays a4, and this is a pawn sacrifice. Black can defend with f6, and now the computer's saying d4, and white has some compensation. Black should play knight to f7, we exchange pawns like this, bishop to c4, white's development is better, black's king is in the middle, so while this does favor white, it's not losing or anything for black. But that's not what was played. We should look at also knight takes b5, in case you were wondering about that. A takes b5, hits the knight, it's got to move, and then we're picking up the pawn on e5. With a much better position for white. So you don't want to do that. So what Van Foreest does, which was probably a prudent decision in the face of an unusual move, he just plays solid bishop to e7. He says, you know what, you can have the pawn on e5. I'm not going to try to hold on to the extra pawn. And Carlsen doesn't take it yet. He plays knight to c3. Again, asking Van Foreest, do you want to try to defend with f6? He says no. He kicks the bishop, which Carlsen drops back to f1. And at this moment where Van Foreest has his final opportunity to try to hang on to the pawn, he decides to give it back, like this, e4. Carlsen captures, we see an exchange of knights, which results in Van Foreest being able to get in the move d5 with tempo on the rook. Drops back to e1. And what do you think white's best move would be in this position if it were white to move? I think a lot of you would probably say d4, staking a claim in the center, getting the two open diagonals for the bishop. That's usually what you want to try to do, which is why Van Foreest here plays d4, simply preventing Carlsen from getting in that move. And now I think a natural thing that a lot of us would do here is play bishop c4, then d3, then get this bishop out. But Carlsen opts for bishop d3. It's usually not a great thing to block your central pawn with a minor piece in the opening like this, but he wants to go to e4 on his next move. So that after bishop e6, we got bishop e4. Van Foreest challenges the bishop on e4, and we got d3, castles, bishop f4. A nice developing move, which comes with a threat. That is, bishop takes c7, queen takes c7, bishop takes d5, grabbing a pawn. So Van Foreest responds with bishop to b4, hitting the rook. It goes to e2, and now rook to c8 defends against that idea of taking the pawn. And now Carlsen would like to develop his queen, but there isn't really a good square. He'd like to go to d2, but the bishop's watching over it, so he decides to challenge that bishop with bishop to d2. Van Foreest moves his bishop back to the e7 square, where Carlsen targets it with queen to e1, threatening to take on d5, followed by taking on e7, winning material. So, bishop takes e4 is played, rook takes e4. We got some pressure on d4 now. Maybe Carlsen will play b4, b5, kick that knight. So f5 from Van Foreest, just to get the rook off of that square. The rook drops back to e2, and now he adds some more protection to this pawn with bishop to f6. But Carlsen goes for b4 anyway. Now we have queen to d5, discouraging this move b5. The queen's watching over that square. h4 from Carlsen now. Maybe he's got ideas of placing a piece on g5. Van Foreest decides to prevent that with h6. And now we have bishop to f4. Getting active, clearing the way to develop the queen now to d2. We have king to h7, queen to d2. The rook moves to the open file. A pair of rooks come off the board. And as a consequence of that last exchange, c7 no longer has protection. So Carlsen grabs it with bishop takes c7. But Van Foreest has foreseen in this position that after bishop to e7, he's going to get the pawn back. He's targeting b4. If you push to b5, the queen and the pawn are there to win the pawn. And if you try to defend with rook to b1, there's going to be queen to a2, hitting the rook, hitting a4. So Carlsen decides to just push to b5, give the pawn back that way. A takes b5, pawn takes, queen takes. Then we have queen to f4, hitting e5. Bishop f6 defends. h5 now, gaining some space, controlling the g6 square. If Carlsen's queen could land on that square with check, guess what? Van Foreest is losing his rook. which is probably why he plays king to g8. Let's not get in any kind of queen g6 check trouble. But here comes queen to d6, infiltrating, threatening to go to d7, hitting the rook, and then how are you going to stay on this open file? Van Foreest finds a nice response to this, though. He plays f4, which means that after queen to d7, which is what Carlsen played, he's got queen takes h5, grabbing a pawn and defending his rook that way. Of course, this does mean that the f4 pawn falls. Carlsen grabs that, and now the queen's hitting b7. So Van Foreest plays queen to f7 to answer that threat. The queens come off the board, and now rook b1 from Carlsen, targeting b7. Rook to e7 defends, and here comes the king towards the middle. We got g5, gaining space, pushing the bishop back, and now rook to d7. And this move was a bit of a mystery to me. I don't really know why he removed the rook from the open file. This pawn didn't really need protection from 3 pieces at this point, so your guess is as good as mine. Carlsen plays a sensible move, though. He plays g4. King to g6 from Van Foreest. Planning h5. Carlsen plays rook to b5. We've got h5, g takes h5 check, the king takes. And now king g2 from Carlsen. He's decided that his king may be more useful on the king side than continuing to move towards the queen side. And he ends up being correct, as you'll see. King to g6 from Van Foreest. Now knight to d2. Eyeing some nice squares, either c4 or e4. Could have some potential. Knight to a7, attacking the rook. Carlsen drops back to b2. So the knight goes back to c6. Van Foreest would be happy with the repetition here. The position is probably objectively drawn at this point, but white does have some pluses, in that black does have 2 pawns which could be potentially targeted. This pawn here and this pawn here, neither can be protected by a pawn. Carlsen really only has 1 weak pawn, and that's this one here. Furthermore, this pawn is blocking the activity of the dark squared bishop, so this is a little bit of a bad bishop, but it's not too bad. It's not completely shut off from all activity. Carlsen continues knight to c4, and now an interesting decision from Van Foreest. He plays g4. Following the principle of placing your pawns on the opposite colored squares from your bishop, however, when doing so, it's important to make sure that the pawn you just moved does not become a target. And this pawn on g4, as you'll see, becomes a little difficult to defend. Carlsen, realizing that he has an opportunity here, goes to work right away, improving his position, playing rook to b5, cutting off the king from moving up to defend the pawn at any point. Rook to e7, perhaps looking to sneak in here and try to pick up the c pawn. But after bishop d6 from Carlsen, Van Foreest, if he ever intended to come into e2, changes his mind here and moves the rook to h7. Now let's take a look and see what would have happened if he did play rook to e2. This would run into rook takes b7. Sure, Carlsen loses his pawn on c2, but then there's rook to b6. Hitting this knight, what are you doing? Anywhere you move, guess what? You're going to have a major problem when this bishop, which is now pinned to the king, is targeted with bishop to d6. So that is totally losing for black. So Van Foreest very wisely moves his rook to h7. His idea is to meet king to g3, trying to round up this pawn, with bishop to h4 check, and then he's going to get this f2 pawn. So Carlsen decides to reroute his knight to d2. He's going to e4 so he can defend that pawn. Knight to a7 again from Van Foreest, hitting the rook, drops back to b1. And at this point, the engine is saying black should try something like rook d7, attacking the bishop, or maybe bishop to d8 for whatever reason. And it thinks white does have an advantage, but black may be able to hold the position at this point. But after king to f5, the move Van Foreest played, the engine says black is already losing. And it's not really clear why this is such a bad move. I would just say that it doesn't really accomplish anything. One threat that Carlsen has after his next move, knight to e4, is to simply move this bishop somewhere and then deliver a check, picking up the b pawn. So that could be one issue with having the king on that vulnerable square. So the way Van Foreest decides to try to deal with this is by playing bishop to e5, covering that d6 square. Even after bishop takes e5, the king captures, and now the king's covering the square. But here we go with king g3, looking to round up the pawn. The rook defends, okay? Now rook b6 from Carlsen, just improving. Maybe the b pawn will be targeted with knight to c5 or knight to d6. Maybe this rook can swing over to this side of the board. And at this point, Van Foreest decides that he needs some kind of counterplay. He plays rook to c7, attacking c2. But this is the beginning of the end. After Carlsen's move, king takes g4. Black is completely busted here. Van Foreest cannot play rook takes c2. And I'm not going to tell you why quite yet, because you are going to see. If you want to take a minute and see what's going to happen if rook takes c2 is played, then you can go ahead and do that. but the answer will be revealed very shortly in a very similar position. Van Foreest, instead of taking that pawn, plays rook to f7. Now if Carlsen were to push his passed pawn with f4, that pawn would be taken with check, which is an important detail, and you'll see why in a minute. Carlsen plays f3, and here we have what could be called a blunder from Van Foreest in an already lost position, which just causes him to lose more quickly. He plays rook to f4 check. How could that be so bad? Carlsen's king has to move to g3. Well, now Carlsen is threatening to capture the pawn on b7, and there's only one way to answer that threat. The obvious move here is rook to f7, but here comes f4 check. And remember how I said it was important that the rook is able to take this pawn with check? Well, here, since his king moved, black cannot capture that pawn with check. Which means, if Van Foreest were to take that pawn, then rook to b7 would attack the knight. And once the knight moves somewhere, let's say to c6, rook to b5 check will win the rook. The king has nowhere to go where it can keep defending. So what is the alternative for Van Foreest? Well, he's in check. He's only got two options here. He can move the king to f5 and lose to a fork. Knight to d6 check will pick up the rook, or he can choose the move that was played in the game, king to d5. And do you see it? I'll give you a second. What should white play here? The move, which Carlsen did not have a chance to play, but would have immediately ended the game, is rook d6, checkmate. Van Foreest saw this move before Carlsen had a chance to play it and resigned the game. So always fascinating to see a 2700 rated Super GM self-destruct and walk right into a checkmate in one move. But this kind of thing does not happen in a vacuum. It happens because Carlsen is such an endgame master, and he will put you in such an uncomfortable position and pose such difficult questions to you that you will become demoralized, as Van Foreest was, making what seems to be, to people like us, imperceptible errors, and probably to Van Foreest too, but not to Carlsen and not to Stockfish. And it's amazing to see how Carlsen's advantage just kept slowly increasing until it finally became obvious that something was very wrong with black's position, even to us mortals. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Please subscribe to the channel for more analysis like this coming soon of Magnus Carlsen's greatest performances.